It's the conflict, it's the, the scandal, the secret things, the politics that's really divisive. But the vast majority of things that happen here, you don't hear about.
We're talking today to Michael Wrathall, who's a friend of mine, someone I've known for a long time and have watched during his career. And what's impressed me has been it's something that I'm passionate about, his belief in servant leadership and his passion for making things change for the better, things that matter. He's, when I met him, an assistant secretary, an SES officer in the Department of Agriculture for wetlands policy and northern water use. And now he's a minister's advisor in the Environment and Water Ministry. Michael, can you tell me a little bit about what fuels your passion, why you do this job, and maybe a little bit more about that space?
Yeah, so I've been interested in water since university. I had this sense that I wanted to do something big in that space. I'm a civil engineer. I'd never been interested in politics, certainly not in the past. But the more I got involved in water, and particularly the really big questions, the really big issues, I realised that it was about values. Ultimately, you've got this really valuable resource. How do you use it best? So coming to this role actually was kind of a bit of an evolution for me, but it's not something I'd foreseen or thought I would do as directly as I do now. As I've gone into this role and as I've worked with other ministers' offices and other people up in Parliament House here, there's a lot of people who are passionate about, the issues and the values that they hold really dearly here too. And the job of a politician and the job of people in their offices is a really tricky job. It's quite intense. You're often, working at strange hours. You're getting called out to do all sorts of, urgent things. You're often responding to issues, problems. The things that tend to come up to the minister are the really tricky things. So it's not the type of role that you just go into flippantly, or it's just, it's not your average job. I have developed a real respect for people, across the divide here who work in this space, and their values may not necessarily align with mine all the time, but I think they're absolutely here to try to do what they think is important. And I think that absolutely deserves respect. And I've developed some really good relationships with people who are passionate about things. And I'm certainly passionate about water. There's people who are passionate about other things. But I respect the fact that, they're willing to do this and put their careers and put themselves out there to try to do something for what they believe is important. And I think that's really what I say is, a lot of politics is about. And politicians I see here as well are actually trying to do what they think is the right thing, align with their values. And, they don't often get a lot of credit for it. So, I don't know if I'd want to be a politician. It's not an easy job. So I think that alone, I've actually got respect for the vast majority of people out here who are really trying to do the best, as they see for the country.
That's something that you mentioned to me in one of our social catch-ups about that there's some good people across the political persuasions that are just trying to do some good stuff for our nation, which in this world of bad news that surrounds us, it gives me some hope. It gives me some encouragement. And I think that connection, most of my audience are public servants. It should give them some connection and hope as well, that these are people doing different roles, the political sphere roles, but they're doing it for a noble cause, which is to better Australia, regardless of whatever their political views are.
And look, that stuff's not newsworthy. For those, particularly in this role, you follow the news a lot. I know a lot of people probably do follow the news a lot. And the bulk of the things that the media think are really worth promoting are the politics that's really divisive or combative or scandalous are the things that you see in the news. But the vast majority of things that happen here, you don't hear about in the media. So there's actually a lot more good and a lot more positive things happening around here than what you perceive by what you're seeing in the news. Actually, the bulk of stuff that happens here and happens in the public service, there are people who are working hard, getting stuff done, getting legislation drafted, changing things for the better overall, hopefully, and trying to address the things that are real challenges. And I think that's probably my sense. Actually, there's probably more good things going on than not. But if you just look at the news, you probably think it's absolutely the other way.
Yeah. Michael, one of the things that I'd like to explore a little bit with you is this concept of policy development, because there's so many passionate public servant policy officers who want a policy that fits perfectly and does everything that the policy can do, but then it doesn't get support. And I told them that the best policy in the world that doesn't get support doesn't do any good. It needs to be a policy that can get support from the different parties and factions and do as much as it can, and then it's incremental growth. I'd love to hear your perspective on that and some of the things that inspire you to keep going in that difficult tumult of getting policy through.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. I mean, it's impossible to get the perfect policy. I mean, what is the perfect policy is one answer to that. But I think you're right around politics. It's very rare you have a political environment where you get everything your own way. Usually you've got multiple different parties you've got to work with. And so really you've got to be willing to compromise on what you think is the best idea. So no matter how much analysis, no matter how rigorous you can be, no matter how good your policy is, if you can't get it through and legislate it, it's not going to make that difference. And so I think there absolutely has to be a recognition of compromise and the need to compromise. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. And that may open doors in the future to do more. And so I think politics is most often incremental in terms of the scale of change that's possible. I mean, they talk about politics being the art of the possible. And I think that's absolutely the reality I've found here. And we're not going to get the perfect outcome from our perspective and the perfect outcome that we've developed up with people in the department. We've got to recognise there'll be some areas of compromise, and hopefully the areas of compromise will still be constructive. And hopefully it will strengthen it, but not necessarily always. And so I think that's the reality of the world we live in. Being satisfied with better, I think, is where the reality of life is, where we can actually make the difference.
I know we've spoken about a quadruple bottom line, really wanting to make the world better.
Yeah, so I know this is certainly an area that we've spoken about before. When we talk about quadruple bottom line here, and this is something that certainly is relevant in the water space, but I think can be applied elsewhere. You've got social, economic, environmental, and cultural values here that when you think about it through those four elements, you really need to hold them in balance and intention at times. If you just solve for one particular of those four, it's going to have impacts on the others, and you're not going to get the ideal outcome. And so it's really having that broad lens and understanding the trade-offs really clearly is the key to getting policy right. And I think it is a really interesting policy debate. I mean, the big one for us here is around the MurrayDarling Basin, where you've got a water resource that goes through multiple states and a territory. It covers, 1 million square kilometres. There's 2.3 million people live in the basin, depend on it for a range of different things. And you've got this finite and valuable resource that you've got to share amongst multiple different uses. You've got water for towns and for drinking, but you've also got it for industrial use, agriculture. It needs to sustain rivers and ecosystems and wetlands. There's also the strong cultural connections that First Nations communities have with land and water in a landscape. So balancing all this in time and space is a really, really challenging dilemma. I think it's something that people managing water worldwide find very, very challenging. But I think in terms of government policy, it's a really, really interesting area because it does touch on so many aspects, and it is really about a pool of different values. So it's both a challenging policy question, but also a really challenging technical question as well. I'm an engineer, and understanding how much water is there and how water might change in time. And there's the technical element that's richly challenging, but you've also got the incredible trade-offs around policy and values. It is really a wicked problem that I think is around the world, people are struggling with this. I've really learnt that looking through those four different lenses and trying to balance and understand those trade-offs is a real key to land the best public policy outcome.
That's such an important thing. And when we start looking at that quadruple bottom line, one of the resources that I used in the design for the community consultation process for the National Male Health Policy was this book by the old MurrayDarling Basin Commission. And it's called Towards a Whole of Community Engagement, a Practical Toolkit by Aslan and Brown. And it is one of the best government written documents I've ever read on community consultation. This one's primarily for riparian zones like the MurrayDarling Basin, but the same principles apply for any type of consultation, I think, around policy stuff that affects people. And it's such an important thing for public servants, politicians, policy officers to get right, is how do we engage, consult, and connect with the people who will be the end users.
I might add to that as well, James, because I think in our work, people are passionate about water, particularly in rural parts of Australia where people know what droughts are like and how valuable water is. And they've got really strong views around how water ought to be used and shared, and strong views about government often. So that consultation piece is absolutely critical. It's just a core part of the business. We've realised, you just can't get the outcome that you're after without doing it well, really. It's absolutely critical, agree. And it is, again, about the relationships, but it's also about the knowledge and being able to communicate this really quite technical, challenging subject in a way that normal people can understand. For those of us like me who live and breathe it, you sort of get in this little bubble. It's actually really helpful to get out to regional communities and have the challenge of being able to communicate the stuff that you live and breathe every day to people who've got their own lives, their own jobs, their own circles that they move. I think it's important for any public servant, really, to do that from time to time, see how you're actually impacting people on the coalface who are impacted by your decisions. More wholesomely measure, better is better.
Better is better.
Which is a really interesting concept.
Yeah. I love that.
So that's a difficult thing. The idea being that you're not going to get the perfect. Oh, yes. I did go back to that. Yeah.